Introduction: The modern shift toward compensation transparency. In the previous section, we examined the real estate agency disclosure and election requirements under ARS, paragraph 32 to 156, which ensure that consumers clearly understand who a real estate professional represents before substantive discussions occur. That disclosure framework focuses on representation, who the agent works for, and what fiduciary duties exist. However, representation alone does not address another critical component of modern real estate practice: compensation transparency. Over the past several years, the real estate industry has seen increasing emphasis on making compensation structures clearer to consumers. Buyers and sellers must understand not only who represents them, but also how real estate professionals are compensated for the services they provide. In Arizona, compensation structures are governed by both statutory law and brokerage policies, and they operate independently from agency relationships. This distinction is extremely important. A consumer may assume that the person paying the commission automatically determines representation, but in reality, representation is determined by agency agreements, while compensation is determined by separate written agreements. For real estate professionals operating in the Phoenix metropolitan market, where buyers, sellers, and investors frequently ask questions about commissions and brokerage fees, clear communication about compensation is essential for both legal compliance and consumer trust. A. Representation versus payment distinction. One of the most common misunderstandings among real estate consumers is the belief that the person paying the commission automatically determines who the agent represents. In reality, representation and payment are separate legal concepts. Agency relationships determine the fiduciary duties owed by the agent, while compensation agreements determine how the brokerage is paid for its services. For example, in a typical residential transaction in Gilbert, the seller may agree to pay a commission that is split between the listing brokerage and the buyer's brokerage. Even though the seller ultimately pays the commission, the buyer's agent still represents the buyer and owes fiduciary duties to the buyer. This distinction is essential because it reinforces that compensation does not dictate loyalty or professional responsibility. Buyers must understand that their agent works on their behalf regardless of how the commission is structured. Clear explanation of this distinction helps eliminate confusion and reinforces the importance of agency disclosure earlier in the transaction process. B. Fully negotiable compensation framework. Real estate commissions in Arizona are fully negotiable between the brokerage and the client. Neither state law nor federal law establishes a fixed commission rate for real estate services. Instead, compensation is determined through negotiation and agreement between the parties involved. This flexibility allows brokers to structure compensation arrangements based on the complexity of the transaction, the level of service provided, and the expectations of the client. For example, a seller in Scottsdale may negotiate a commission structure with their listing broker that reflects the marketing strategy, expected listing period, and services provided during the transaction. Similarly, a buyer working with a buyer's agent in Mesa may agree to compensation terms that define how the brokerage will be paid for assisting with property searches, negotiations, and contract preparation. The key principle is transparency. Consumers should clearly understand the compensation structure before entering into a brokerage relationship so that there are no surprises later in the transaction. C. Documentation through separate written agreements. To maintain transparency and regulatory compliance, compensation agreements should always be documented in separate written agreements. These agreements may include listing agreements, buyer representation agreements, or other brokerage service contracts. Written agreements clearly define the services provided by the brokerage and the compensation associated with those services. Documenting compensation arrangements also helps reduce disputes because both parties understand their financial obligations from the beginning of the relationship. For example, when a seller signs a listing agreement with a brokerage in Chandler, the agreement typically specifies the commission percentage or fee structure that will be paid upon successful completion of the transaction. Similarly, a buyer representation agreement may outline how the brokerage will be compensated if the buyer purchases a property during the representation period. Written agreements provide clarity and help ensure that both the client and the brokerage understand the financial terms of their relationship. D. Risk management in a post-commission transparency environment. As the real estate industry evolves toward greater transparency regarding commissions and brokerage services, agents must adopt risk management practices that reflect this changing environment. Transparency reduces misunderstandings, but also requires agents to communicate clearly and document conversations related to compensation. For example, a buyer working with an agent in Tempe may ask whether the agent's services are free because the seller pays the commission. While this perception is common, it is important for the agent to explain that compensation is negotiated between the parties and may vary depending on the transaction structure. Clear documentation of compensation discussions helps prevent disputes later in the process. In addition, brokers should ensure that agents are trained to discuss compensation in a professional and transparent manner that complies with both brokerage policies and regulatory requirements. By proactively addressing compensation questions, agents can strengthen consumer trust and reduce the likelihood of complaints. E. Consumer acknowledgement of responsibility. Another important aspect of compensation transparency is consumer acknowledgement. When consumers sign brokerage agreements that outline compensation structures, they acknowledge that they understand the services being provided and the financial terms associated with those services. This acknowledgement reinforces the principle that real estate transactions involve informed decision-making by all parties involved. For example, when a buyer signs a representation agreement with an agent in Phoenix, the agreement typically explains how the brokerage will be compensated if the buyer purchases a property during the representation period. By signing the agreement, the buyer confirms that they understand the compensation terms and agree to the structure outlined in the document. Consumer acknowledgement helps protect both the client and the brokerage by ensuring that expectations are clearly defined from the beginning of the professional relationship. Discussion questions. Why is it important for consumers to understand the difference between agency representation and compensation? Answer: because representation determines fiduciary duties, while compensation determines how the brokerage is paid. Why are real estate commissions considered negotiable in Arizona? Answer: because state law does not set commission rates and compensation must be negotiated between the parties involved. How do written agreements help prevent disputes regarding compensation? Answer: by clearly documenting the services provided and the financial terms agreed upon by the client and brokerage.